a quick word to thank you all coming in this incredible place. I confess, it is the first time I see this place. It's a cinema from the 20th century, 1920. There is a Chaplin vitrail over there. You may have a look over there. I want to thank you to Commissioner Ribera for having accepted the invitation from the Concurrence Review. And I want also to thank our sponsors, Analysis Group, and Clary Gottlieb. Without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Antoine Chapsal, going to present the speakers on tonight's ceremony. So we have this panel, then we have a reception, we have the dinner after, and there will be a keynote from Professor Jean Tirole. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave you Antoine Chapsal.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Antoine Chapsal, partner and head of Europe for Analysis Group. Before we begin, I would like to thank our co-hosts, so Cleary and Concurrences, for making this event possible. A special thanks to two Cleary partners who initiated this event with me, Frédéric Debure, who is somewhere here, and Séverine Schramek, with whom I'm very pleased to moderate this panel. So tonight we are privileged to have a truly exceptional lineup of speakers. First, Ms. Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera. So you are the newly appointed European Commissioner for Clean, Fair and Competitive Transition. Beyond your new role at the European Commission, you have always been a key figure in climate and energy policy, leading Spain's green transition and promoting sustainability on a global scale. Ms. EVP Ribera, I believe that this is your very first panel since taking office, so a special thank and special welcome, and thank you again for being here with us this evening. Jean Tirole, so you are one of the most distinguished economists of our time. I will try to summarize your work and your career later to introduce your keynote speech, but for now, let's just say that you were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2014. You are the chairman of the board of the Jean-Jacques Lafon Foundation at the Toulouse School of Economics, and you have been a key actor and commentator of all major economic policy debates of the last few decades. Thank you for being here tonight and for your continued support over the years. Pierre Régibaud, so right there, you are a former star chief economist at the European Commission's DG Comp. So after a 2-year garden leave, you are back, and we are thrilled to announce that you will be joining Analysis Group as an antitrust and intellectual property expert in a few weeks. So welcome, Pierre. Now I hand over to Séverine, who will set the stage for our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antoine. It's my pleasure to co-moderate this panel with you today, and I would like to start it by reiterating how glad we are to be there here tonight, and how grateful mostly we are to all our outstanding panelists for having accepted to share their views with us today, in particular Mr. VP Ribera, as you mentioned, Antoine. This really promises to be a truly exceptional discussion. We are living in very uncertain times, times where a crisis follows another. Every day we hear about the multiple threats which may impact our lives in many different manners, be them geopolitical, economical, social, sanitary, to take just a few examples. But the threat posed by climate change, which we have now been all conscious of for many years, is maybe the most fundamental one. It will affect not only our societies in its dynamics, but it will also affect our way of life. It will have an impact on each and all of us as individuals. In 2019, President Ursula von der Leyen presented the Green Deal, a comprehensive strategy aimed at making the EU climate neutral by 2050. This initiative set ambitious targets to reduce carbon emissions, enhance green innovation, and transition to a circular economy, putting Europe at the forefront of the fight for sustainability, in particular these days when these issues have fallen down on the list of priorities of other world economic powers. More recently, Mario Draghi's report identified the imperative to establish a joint roadmap for decarbonation and competitiveness. And only 1 week ago, the European Commission, with you, Mr. VP Ribera, presented a clean industrial deal, which aims at making decarbonation both achievable and profitable for the European industry, with a focus on energy-intensive companies and the clean tech sector. 20 years after the adoption of an economics-based approach to the enforcement of competition law, the environmental transition has now also sparked renewed questions about the role of competition as a driver of economic growth and environmental sustainability. DG Competition has already started tackling this issue. Just a few examples. The competition policy brief of April 2024 outlined the role of sustainability parameters in merger control. The revised market definition notice also reflects the importance of sustainability considerations as non-price parameters when assessing substitutability in product markets. And of course, the revised guidelines on horizontal agreement include a whole dedicated chapter on sustainability agreements, which embrace a broad definition of such agreement in an effort to make sure that competition policy does not stand in the way of horizontal cooperation that pursues genuine sustainable development objectives. And it is very meaningful that you, Ms. Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera, are entrusted to lead us through a clean, just, and competitive transition in that order. And I'm, of course, referring to the name of your portfolio. So we see that there is a convergence of factors which signal a potential, if not an already ongoing shift in competition policy. The question arises of whether it should now incorporate not only competitiveness, but also sustainability as one of its core objectives, in particular as many businesses are looking to combine forces to fight climate change. How to shape economic policies to reach sustainability objectives? Jean Tirole, obviously you're Nobel Prize of Economy and you've been working on these issues for, well, a long time now. And so with your expertise, with the expertise of Mr. VP Ribera and that of you, Pierre Régibaud, we look forward to a thought-provoking discussion on the evolving role of competition policy in promoting sustainability as the EU adapts to a new global economic reality in what is a complex landscape. And with that, Antoine, maybe I can let you kick off our panel.
Thank you, Séverine. So you rightly mentioned the question of whether competition policy should now include competitiveness and sustainability as core objectives. So we have seen competition authority argue that sustainability and in particular the achievement of climate goals should be considered as an objective in competition enforcement. So maybe my first question should be to what extent should sustainability objectives offset more traditional competition concerns such as price increases and output reductions? So perhaps, Jean or Miss Ribera.
I thought I came to take notes on your very good ideas and to have a drink. And I found myself having a drink before speaking, which is also a very dangerous approach to this panel. Thank you so much. And I feel quite honored to be part of this panel and to be in this hall with so many people that have devoted their professional lives to competition and economics in general, but also competition law, which is very important in order to win the cases when we, the Commission, arrive to the court, being challenged in some cases by some of you. Now, I think that, in fact, if I stick to my mission letter, what I have been asked to do is to keep on going, to modernize the approach on how we enforce the competition policy, not to dramatically change the competition policy, but to be sure that we continue an approach that allows us to evolve, to take into consideration the reality, including the market forces. There is no business that does not take into consideration that being efficient in the use of materials, that takes into consideration possibilities dealing with liability cases in case there is an absence of consideration of the climate impacts and the prejudice and the cost and harm that can create. So this is part of what it is already in the market. And I think that this is not new. As you have already stated, there have been several approaches that have facilitated a much more acknowledgeable understanding and position from the competition services, not only in the Commission, but in the national authorities and beyond the national authorities in the European Union. So yes, to a certain extent, of course, we need to take this into consideration. No, if we were trying to impose through the competition policy the achievement of the goals. Of course, that's not the purpose of the competition policy. The limits, the legal framework to take decisions is what it is in the treaties, what it is in the existing regulation. The way we try to reach the community is through the different guidelines that allow anyone to understand how we evolve in this approach. And there are different aspects that may be relevant in this case when thinking about which is the relevant market, something that is important when we read again the Draghi's report, but also how we can contribute to a certain extent, or at least not to make more difficult to achieve this type of goals. If there are some market failures that are very well described by the academia, is very precisely failures that are connected to the lack of consideration of climate impacts or environmental impact. So I think that yes, we are learning. And yes, we will have to take this as a very relevant aspect, but as I said, not because it is the main purpose of the competition tools or the main purpose of the competition law. That's not the case, but of course we need to assess what is the market reality of today.
I'm sure this is exactly what you think from an academic perspective.
Yes, good evening. I fully agree with what the Commissioner said. Just to put things in perspective, I mean, the usual debate about whether we want to stay within the realm of competition or if we want to broaden the scope of competition policy, add inequality, environment, whatever, public health, media plurality, all the market failures that the Commissioner was talking about. And God knows there are lots of market failure, but we should not forget there's also a huge government failure because government is there to correct the market failure and just doesn't do that. And we see that the most clearly in the realm of the environment, but many other fields as well. So the question is, I wrote a formula, a sentence of Sir John Vickers. Should competition monopolize merger policy? And my own view is that, yes, those goals are legitimate, hugely legitimate, but the question is, should the regulators regulate the regulators, in a sense, because there is a huge government failure. We don't tackle, for example, climate change, not enough, and should various agencies, including DG Comp, actually be in charge of correcting the market failures that the politicians don't correct themselves. And I have maybe 4 reservations. And again, I'm all in favor, of course, of all those criteria. But the first is a lack of capability. If we do that, the agencies, the ministries, the courts, whoever is in charge of doing it, should have the capability of checking the claims, the emissions of firms, let's take the environment, the methodology, define the methodology of what's green and what's not green. I mean, we could spend for hours on that particular question. And also have the instruments. So it's not clear if the instrument, for example, to correct inequality is education and, of course, distribution. Is the agency able to do it? If the issue is the environment, does it have a carbon tax? So there's availability of measurement, the availability of instruments. The second reservation I have is that too many cooks spoil the broth. That's a question of who is in charge. So we have to do much more in terms of the environment, but is it the Ministry of the Environment? Is that DG Comp? Is that the ECB? Is that the court? Are public procurement officers in charge? And that's serious. In France, we have a law. And some other country, and Greece, I don't know about Spain, but we have a law saying you have to take into account the environment criteria into public procurement. And you just wonder, why do we do that? There is a simple instrument, there is a carbon tax to force firms and to internalize that. And why we asking somebody else to do it? But you have lots of people which are doing it now, and that raises the issue of accountability. I don't want to speak for too long, but let me just mention briefly two other issues with this mix. The issue of missions, that's something I've worked a lot with Mathias de Watripon, who is here today. The necessity of having missions, clear missions, and narrow-minded missions. I like narrow-minded people. And I'm narrow-minded myself. Something can be held accountable for. The Prime Minister is much harder to have a mission because the Prime Minister is in charge of everything. But at least the agencies have the advantage, or the ministries have the advantage of having a relatively clear mission, which, by the way, protects them. Something I'm very concerned about is that independent agencies here, or the ECB, might at some point lose their independence because they are going into soil which is basically political soil. And that might be an issue in the future. And finally, and it's connected to that, is that we should not encourage governments to pass the buck. It's very hard for governments. It's very hard to redistribute. It's very hard to reduce carbon emissions and so on. We know there is a huge opposition to that. But nonetheless, it's a government's job to do that. My own view is that we should be doing competition policy. I'm sorry I took too long.
Monsieur Pierre.
What? Yeah, fair. Oh, c'est parfait. That suits me. Nothing to do. That's my forte. I will not express a position that is really different, but maybe with some nuances. Clearly, everybody here on this stage agrees that climate targets and environmental protections are legitimate goals of EU policy. And since competition policy is one of the tools of the Commission, it probably is useful to think of those targets and those goals in the context of competition policy. What makes it even kind of more important is that while we sometimes are very busy with temporary crises like COVID and Ukraine, the green crisis is one that's going to face us not for 3, 4, 5 years, but for decades to come. So clearly, yes, we should think about green issues in the context of competition policy. Now, however, we have lots of policy tools. It's important to use the right policy tools for the right issues. That doesn't mean that there is, one policy tool for one issue. Sometimes you gain from combining them, but we have to be careful. And you only want to use a tool if it's essentially it has huge incentive effects. Here, huge incentive to privilege green technologies and something like that. That is efficient in doing so, and I tell you in a moment what I mean by efficient, and also if it's transparent. The last thing that you want, and I'm rejoining something that Jean says there, is for politicians to use competition policy not because it's the best tool, but because it's the less transparent tool, is the one where they don't have to take their political responsibility. This is not what competition policy is for, right? So what about competition policy? What is naturally, potentially useful to green objective? Clearly, state aid is an area where you cannot neglect green targets. As the Executive Vice President said, in state aid, the first step is always to identify the market failure, and clearly environmental issues is a place ripe with market failure. But when you think about the rest of competition policy, things have become a little less obvious. There's not even mentioned abuse of dominance. Why would we tolerate abuse of dominance for green reason? I can't even think of a far-fetched example. But what about mergers? Well, generally speaking, as an economist, I would say that merger is unlikely to be the right solution for almost any kind of green issues. Why? Because to some extent, consumers, even if they don't care enough about green, care about green. So to that extent, there's a competitive dimension in investing in green and so on. As you know, if there are no efficiency, if you combine two entities, they will not compete with each other. That tends to reduce green activity. And that's something to be really, really careful about. You would not want, in the name of helping and reaching green targets, to end up essentially decreasing the efforts that a firm puts at. Now, it's not always the case. It's certainly not the case when there are efficiencies. What kind of efficiencies are we looking at? Clearly, complementarities are likely to be efficiencies. You have some, most firms in the world have not developed a huge expertise in green, so some people will know a little bit and others another bit, so letting them kind of combine, and we'll go back to this later in the show, if I dare say, when we discuss about agreements between. But that, to exploit those synergies, you can do it with agreement. You don't need kind of a full merger. So it's only going to be the rare case where the full merger itself passes the test of necessity. So the full integration, including the coordination of prices, could actually be necessary. That can be the case. So it can be the case, for example, if competition would not ensure enough of a reward, and it is not possible for the government to effectively substitute itself to a price increase by giving subsidies or by taxing the old technologies. So in that case, as Jean pointed out, yes, theoretically, I can come up with governmental solutions that would be better than allowing the merger, but the government does not always work very well. So there might be cases where we could consider that overall paying the firms for an increase in prices might not be the worst thing in the specific cases. And then finally, I think it's the kind of argument that we have to pay really a lot of attention to. It's not to do with just the techniques themselves and the products, but about green innovation. For two reasons. First, the EU only accounts for 8% of CO emission. So even if we're perfect, that's not going to help that much. On the other hand, if we innovate, we have green technologies. We can share them for a fee, by the way, which is great for us, with the rest of the world. So there, I would say that's where competition policy should be very careful in not getting in the way of green innovation. And there, for those of you who think of potential argument for potentially justifying not only agreements but whole mergers, that's probably the most fertile field, because what are the reasons why you might need to have one entity rather than others, besides complementarity? That has to do with the imperfection of intellectual property rights and markets for property rights. Because otherwise, I would tell you, look, you think that if you can have a bigger market share, you're going to innovate more, but why don't you license to others and make money? But we know that licensing markets do not always work well because intellectual property rights do not always work well, and that depends on the kind of industry. And in that case, it might make sense to actually have the integration of two parties into a commonly owned ownership where you're not going to screw up yourself in order to kind of fix the incentive. And that's where I will stop.
Thanks, Pierre. This is a nice transition to the next question we actually had, which is about the revision of the horizontal merger guidelines, you have announced, and I think it's in your mission letter as well, Ms. EVP Ribera, that there will be such a revision. And it has been argued by many people, maybe even people within this room, that under the current guidelines, the efficiency test is too strict also to allow the Commission to fully take into account potential benefit for sustainability resulting from a merger. And Pierre, as you mentioned, it might be the case that there are some. So is this something that should be changed, that we could expect to be changed in the new guidelines? And if so, how do we do to assess ex ante sustainability effects of a merger? As Jean mentioned before, it's a difficult exercise. And how do we make sure that we have the right way to assess whether the benefits will be enough to overweight potential negative effects of a merger?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question. My expectations when coming here was to come to take notes. So in order to take notes and learn how I can perform better, I'm going to try to wrap up what I've heard, to be sure that what I've heard means what I think that I've heard. First, of course, we cannot do politics or try to achieve other sectoral goals, which are very important, through the competition tools. But second, there is nothing that prevents or that even advises us against taking into consideration that sustainability and climate are things relevant in terms of market forces. So we have policy goals that have been supported by the European Union, which are very important, which are part of the societal expectations on the business development, that play in a context where we are in charge of being sure that there is a level playing field, that the market behaves in a transparent manner, that there are not abuses in the functioning of the market, that there may be a new generation of innovators challenging, contexting the existing ones. And at the same time, we have also learned that the relevant markets may be much bigger than the traditional markets where our business have been operating. So in fact, we need to assess to what extent this combination of rules and principles, including those policy goals that are not part of our mission, but that operate in a context that is exactly the same context where we operate and are supported exactly by the same stakeholders that we need to serve for, need to take into consideration all these realities. So that's what I've understood from the previous comments being made by my peers in this panel. And then I enter into the guidelines on mergers, because it's true, this is something that is so fashionable, the champions. Which are the champions and how we get more champions? And then I learned that there are also competition cases dealing with football, which is even worse. So, but the champions. And to what extent relaxing the assessment of the conditions for mergers may be a solution. And then, of course, someone would remind us, hey, being a champion is not a goal as such. And we need to protect the consumers, and we need to protect a well-functioning market. So you cannot say that you are going to sign a free check to do whatever on mergers. That's absolutely true. And I fully subscribe that. And I think that through the process, we count on very professional people that are able to make a broad assessment on how potential operations may prevent a well-functioning market, may create disturbance, or may have no problem. That is a good thing. At the same time, we also know that in many cases, we could think in terms of how these market forces work and to what extent, in order to facilitate innovation, there is a possibility that makes sense to combine different specialities or possibilities or capacities that may play in an horizontal manner and not just in a vertical way. And that's because this is a role, we need to enter into these cases and to find out to what extent it works or not. And happily, we have more than 20 years of the court stating on this type of situations where sometimes they have supported the position being defended and being decided by the DG Competition. In some other cases, it has not been the case. The question right now, which I think it is pretty fair, is that it may be a good opportunity to open this discussion, to make a sound assessment on whether we may come up with updated guidelines, and it is not so easy to differentiate when it is horizontal or vertical mergers operation, to what extent there may be an opportunity to update, taking into consideration that, of course, the market forces have been under renovation for a long time, and now sustainability concerns may become particularly important, given the fact that the relevant markets in many of these potential operations dealing with sustainability, that does not mean that the guidelines are only going to operate on sustainability fields, may have evolved in such a way that there is room to accept that theoretically this can take place. So, to say that I have my pen ready to take note of whatever you may say about this, but no worries, if you have no ideas yet, we will open this conversation in the coming weeks and we will be waiting for your assessment because it will be very important. And I'm speaking about updating guidelines, which may facilitate many things, and of course, we expect to have sound and consistent approaches that facilitate the life of whichever company that wants to enter into these eventual mergers operations, and that counts on good basis or good pre-assessment on whether this may be viable.
Pierre, you seem to have ideas on the matter as well. I don't know if Jean wants to comment before.
I can say a few words, possibly on 2 points. The first picks up on the first question about how do you measure the gains in, say, for the environment. So again, you need to have a staff to do that and not just rely on the claims of the firms, because the claims will always be huge, of course. So if you have this measurement ability, sometimes actually you can incorporate the environmental criterion. Actually, Chapter 9 of the Horizontal Merger Guidelines got it right. It said we should correct the residual market failure. There's a price of carbon in Europe. Let's use this price of carbon in Europe and let's use that as a measurement tool. Now, for the environment, it's not too hard if we can measure the emissions. If you start talking about degradable or non-degradable plastic or privacy or things like that, that's a little bit more difficult to put numbers on it. And I emphasize that because, again, I come back to France. Sorry, that's what I know. But, this law in France basically said to the local authorities, include the environment into your criteria. It's nice. I mean, how can you be against that? It's wonderful. Except that they didn't say whether the price of carbon was, €1 or 1,000 euros. What should you take into account? What is a green measure? There was no guidelines. It's just like, go ahead and just help your friends. I exaggerate a little bit, but there is a little bit of that. I can expect a fair amount of corruption from that. That bothers me. But let's assume we can measure and we can give good guidelines. That's the kind of thing we should be doing. Here is what you should be doing if we are going to use non-competition criteria. And then there is the issue of the efficiency test. Yes, it's too strict. Because the efficiency test, you remember, you have to compare the gains from consumers in one relevant market with the losses to consumer in another relevant market, but you don't consider the net amount, at least not in Europe, in Chapter 9 again. The CMA in the UK does so, allows to have some comparison. But still there are issues, even with the CMA case, because in the CMA, they compare the benefits and the cost. For example, the cost in terms of competition, higher prices, and the benefits in terms of the environment, that's fine. But what is the contradiction? And actually you touch on that, which is, if you think about the environment, less than 1% of the pollution in the world is in the UK. So if you compare the cost for the UK consumers with the benefit for UK citizens of reduced pollution, then the environment criterion is never going to play any role. Same thing for fair trade, for sustainable cotton and so on. The gains are not in the UK or won't be in Europe. So, and Pierre mentioned the 8% of emissions from Europe. So there is an issue about what is the jurisdiction. And that's a very broad issue. Of course, every time we talk about fair trade or the environment or aid, we face this issue. But we have to solve it somehow, because it's pretty rare that the same people are both a consumer and the beneficiary of environmental or societal benefit.
Okay, so let me say a few words on that. And first, going to variation. What are the two kinds of variation we would have to get into if we were to take green efficiency seriously? One is what we call non-use benefits. I like the fact that you have a park in town, even if I never go to the park. There are techniques in environmental economics in order to evaluate those things. They do involve a fair amount of footwork, like surveys and things like that. The second thing, of course, are the externalities. And again, how do you measure externalities? If you look at CO emission, we have the ETS, which supposedly is going to give you what the right price for this kind of pollution is. I say supposedly. Why? Because, of course, what's happening in this ETS and the price of those permits depend on how many permits you put in the markets. Now, unfortunately, I have never seen a thorough study of what the price should be. You put a given amount of the market, you think it's right, and then there's a price. That should go the other way. You should have kind of a study that tells you what is actually the cost to Europe of CO emissions, okay? And then from then, you should infer how many permits you should have on the market. We haven't done that. So since we haven't done that, just using the ETS price would not necessarily be something good. As long as we don't have this point of reference, frankly, estimating the benefit from externality is a bit of a hopeless project. Yes, you wanted to intervene on that.
No, please go ahead. Finish.
Okay. So I'm with Jean there. In theory, we can evaluate those things, but there are lots of specific expertise necessary for that. Maybe some reform of the ETS. And because of that, actually thinking about the revision of the guideline, because it's so specific to green, rather than start messing up with the standard of efficiencies in general term, I would actually favor having a specific chapter or paragraph on green externalities. And actually, you could even go further. They say if you're going to make a green externality argument, maybe we need more time on the clock to do kind of a serious job, because if we're really hampered by the Eurocrux that we have, we're just going to kind of pretend to take things seriously. So that was kind of my first point. Now, the second point is a bit subtle, and that has to do whether we have to take into account, as we do currently, externalities only within the relevant market, or whether we take the externalities for European consumers outside of the market. As economists would say, you take into account the externalities to all European consumers. But that's actually not that completely obvious. Why? Because when we do mergers and efficiency, we just focus on the relevant market, and we say, okay, the price might go up, but the cost or quality is going to improve enough that consumers are better off. If consumers are better off, who would object? There's nobody to object. Now take the example here where, because of lots of externality outside of the market, you would agree to a merger that's going to increase the price in the relevant market more than the benefit to the people in that market. Now they are losers. You cannot just say nobody cares about it. So you're much more in the realm of policy when you make some investment in terms of getting an objective. You invest essentially the pain that you inflict on those consumers to achieve an objective. And then, is it just enough to say, okay, well, overall it's positive? That's not what we usually do. We have limited resources, and when we look at policy projects, we look at social rate of return, and we only do those that have high enough of a social rate of return. If we have an attitude where any mergers that just squeaks by with something positive is okay, that essentially amounts to favoring lesser efficient projects over potentially more efficient project.
So you would not advise that?
I would not advise to do this
No, me neither,
automatically,
but
arithmetically.
No, yes, me neither. Yeah. No, but I have a point on what you say, because in fact, if I follow your argument, the question is that since we cannot measure the externalities, tampi, we cannot take that into consideration.
No, we should try.
Well, that's it. We should try. This is why I'm expecting to take notes on how we deal with these aspects. Because you have commented on public procurement, the two of you, in two occasions. And in my former position, I tried to pay attention to something which was important. If I only take into consideration the lowest possible price in a given circumstance that, well, is the European one, where there may be suppliers that do not reflect in a transparent manner the real cost, we may be entering into such a situation that when we take into consideration a given time, longer time, we will be favoring no supply. We would not have counting on any safe space to ensure innovation, to reinvest, to improve the quality of our industries, and so on and so on. So the problem is that we need to find a balance between transparency, impact on consumers, both final consumers and industrial consumers, capacity to promote more efficiency, sustainable and more performant products in the time to come, which is not our main mission, but we cannot be blind because it is a market force. So I think that it could not be a good piece of advice if we say, well, this is so impossible that in fact we need to give up on this. On the contrary, I think that this is a try to identify how the public procurement may take into consideration elements that are not just the price element, which is not easy. And of course, as you say, the most difficult issue is how we objectivize these other criteria to be taken into consideration to avoid corruption in the worst case scenario, or at least being challenged because it is not so easy to explain, to reason, to rationate why the decision was this one and not this other one. And this is pretty challenging. That I agree. But at the same time, I think that if we stick to the traditional way we understood what we are doing, we may be even going in the contrary sense of our main purpose, which is a level playing field and a well-functioning market, because we will be favoring those that do not care about labor cost, for instance. The lowest labor cost, the better is going to be the price that they offer. So I think that it is time to keep on doing something that it is not starting from the scratch. Happily, the very professional people working in the DG competition, thanks to the former chief economist, among others, has evolved into these type of considerations, trying to reflect a proper evolution of the guidelines and the regulation to facilitate these things being taken into consideration. And I think that the existing, the former assessment on how to deal with these mergers was from, I don't know when, but a long time ago. It is time to update and to share in a transparent manner how we can proceed. It is time to wonder to what extent not only state aid, but the other traditional competition tools and the new tools that try to respond to the new challenges and the new market forces that are real forces in our market count on an updated vision, and that's what we are trying to do, and that's how I read my mission letter.
So we see you have ambitious objectives for the coming months and years. That's really good to hear. I'd like to switch a little bit topics, if that's okay, to move to antitrust, which is also of interest to many people in this room. We see that more and more companies are willing to cooperate to, set sustainability standards for an industry or favor more sustainable products, but there is always this issue of Article 101, which they are facing and which led to the new horizontal guidelines tackling that issue. But we do see initiatives from different authorities, including the European Commission, of course, the Dutch Competition Authority, the CMA in the UK, the French Competition Authority, which have all issued guidelines, and some of them have also implemented an open door policy, inviting companies to seek informal guidance on their agreements. So we are seeing, an heterogeneity in the different approaches of the different authorities, which is starting to create some legal certainty issues in Europe. So do you share this view? If so, do you think that the European Commission should do more to create a one-stop shop guidance scheme? Should it encourage cross-border initiatives, including with jurisdiction outside of Europe? All maybe question for you first, Mrs. VP Ribera, and then the panelists as well. Sorry for not allowing to take your notes.
No. I think that it may be more a question of how we land and learn from the experience than a real problem. I think that the guidelines being issued back in 2023 were pretty helpful and welcome. There may be different aspects that have been treated or developed by some national authorities. I would say that in the big picture, the differences are not so big, and when there have been some questions being raised in terms of to what extent this could bring us into an uncertain context, things have been solved in an informal way with no drama behind. But it is true that it may remain calm, but be wise. So we count on this European competition network where the different national authorities can share their views, and probably it's a good moment to have a proper conversation around these possibilities. It's true that trying to identify a safe space to communicate sensitive information, to try to get a relevant breakthrough requires a specific treatment. It's true that we have already these guidelines in place. It's true that there may be different approaches coming from national authorities, and it is true that we should try to solve this apparent discomfort or disagreements to prevent any type of feeling of uncertainty. But I guess that we have the tools and the capacity to do it in a smart manner.
I mean, the issue is clear. I mean, if you want to be more virtuous as a firm and you're the only one to do it, then you're going to lose market share because the others have a lower production cost. So if you're using degradables, plastic, for example, then it's not going to be as good in terms of profit as less virtuous plastic. So somehow they have to move together as opposed to the first mover advantage, which is actually a disadvantage. And how do you do that? The issue is, of course, that it could be some kind of agreement among competitors, possibly. So I think it's natural to bring actually to the competition authority the prime and say, maybe we'll do better in that dimension collectively. Then there is this difficult issue because some of the writings say that's fine if you don't constrain your competitors to do that, but sometimes you cannot, you have to constrain, otherwise you lose the market share, right? So that's difficult. And in the end, that means that the competition authority has to decide. It's not up to the industry to decide, but it's doing policy. It's doing public policy. And obviously, again, if you have a clear criterion, it's easy. If you have carbon price and you can measure it. I mean, I'm always repeating the same thing, but it's important, and because of the discretionary aspect to it. The competition authority will make sure, and that's not controversial, that there is no exchange of information beyond what is needed, and ancillary restraints. Using the standard to erect barriers to entry, which is a standard strategy of firms. All those things we all agree on, and of course that's why also the competition authority should be taking the decision. But there is this, again, the same issues of measurement, the same issue of who is doing public policy in the end, and is that politics, or is that the role of a specialized and independent agency? And that's a very important question.
Okay, I'm actually fairly optimistic on this count. First, why would you want the firms to cooperate? The obvious thing that is it has been there forever, is that if there are some kind of cost synergies, complementarities, and so on, fine. We all know that, and I no longer want to hear the industry on this side to say, oh, we never know when we're going to, violate the law or not. It's been there for 25 years. Take some risk. But what's different about the green side is that you have to distinguish between two situations. One is a more standard situation where you want to innovate, to have a greener product, and consumers care enough about it that it's actually going to be at least sufficiently profitable to have the green product if at least consumers recognize this as a true green product. And this issue has already been addressed by the Commission in the late revision when we have these whole sections on labeling. That's the whole point of labeling, is to be able to distinguish yourself. But we recognize also that if everybody has his own label, nobody can know what's happening. So some concentration of label can be tolerated in the market. So that point has been dealt with, and I think quite intelligently, in the revised guidelines. What's become harder, and that's the case that Jean evoked, is because of the externalities, that's something that you would want, but it would not pay for itself. So there, in a way, if you're the only one to do it, you're going to be screwed. Then people would say, okay, but that's fine, then we need to set a standard. And I agree, there needs to be some kind of setting of standards there, but we have to be careful about what kind of standard we're talking about. We're not talking about the interoperability standards that we used to. With interoperability standards, it's very natural to let the parties work very closely and very deeply with each other, because you have to define complex technologies that work with each other. That's not the issue here. The issue here is much more quality or minimum standard. So yes, we should allow for this kind of coordination, but the minimum necessary. And there are well-established principles. For example, you should tend to define performance, not how the performance is reached, i.e. level of CO emission or percentage of non-recyclable material, without imposing the way in which that should be imposed. And the more you deviate from this kind of standard and you say, oh, but for some reason we have to agree on a specific technology, well, then competition policy would say, why? maybe there's going to be cases where, yes, it's unavoidable in order to reach those standards, those minimum standards, you need to agree on specific technology, but it's not obvious, so you've got to make the case. So the more closely you want to work together, the tougher we should be with you. And you should be able to justify it. I think in most cases, having associations that define kind of minimum standards defined in terms of performance should suffice in most industries.
That raises also the issue of business review letters, or
yes,
the open door policies. I mean, should the competition authority be doing all the job? I mean, because you are going to get thousands of those proposals, right? Or should you just pick your fights among the best proposals?
But you don't. You think that you'd get thousands of such proposals, and you have kind of a whole industry that screams that they would like to know, and then you tell them, as the Commission is done for us, we're not going to have formal comfort letter, but if you want to talk, we're ready to talk. And the number of people who show up is actually very, very low. That's.
Well, yeah, it depends on the authority and on the way the open door policy is crafted, I believe. But yeah.
Yeah.
Antoine, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe the last point that I would like to tackle today is state aid, because we have this new state aid framework as part of the Clean Industrial Deal. So maybe a question for the Commission: how the Commission is going to strike the right balance between promoting sustainability on the one hand and preventing member states from using the new state aid framework to favor like national energy champions, and which could undermine the level playing field that you were mentioning.
We do not intend to promote national energy champions.
So it's not going to be the aim of the new state aid framework.
But I have a colleague in the Commission that makes a joke when introducing himself, saying traditionally you had to swear on the Bible, now you need to swear on Draghi's report. Once I say that, a combination of what it is there, most of it being reflected in the mission letters, not everything, but dealing with these aspects, the stated guidelines, we propose to go through a review to try to facilitate a better understanding, according to the lessons learned during these years of the crisis, the energy crisis, how to promote a quick response to the main concerns being expressed in the Clean Industrial Deal. So the energy, the decarbonization of the industry, and the manufacturing of clean tech. What we have tried to work on, I insist very much on this, according to the existing experience and the court, the pronouncements of the court dealing with the state aid, is to give some orientation on how to simplify and what are the intensity and the combination of things that may be taken into consideration without creating or undoing the single market, the level playing field among member states, and the level playing field among the different companies. And well, you will know in the coming days what all of this is about, because we will open for the public consultation the draft in the coming days.
So in terms of energy transition, unsurprisingly, I would recommend using the standard economic tools first. Not only them, but obviously carbon pricing. It's very efficient, it's very simple. I repeat it because that's very important. And I know it's not well accepted, but that's really what works. in all its form. For example, economists are not terribly satisfied with CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, because it's not perfect, fine, but at least it's economics based. It's based on the difference between carbon prices in the countries. It's a way of protecting our industry. We should also have more Europe, so I'm going to do some drag here. More Europe, of course. I mean, electricity, we have been saying it for 20 years or more. We have an energy market, electricity market, but we still have 27, I don't know how many grids and how many regulators of electricity. That's not the way to build a market. And we need to really do something about it. Infrastructures. Thank you. We need to do disruptive innovation. Again, that's something we don't do very well. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but we don't do that very well in Europe. And disruptive innovation, we need it very, very badly, given the reluctance to have a carbon price. And now it's so late in the game that disruptive innovation is very important. And in terms of sovereignty, it's a more difficult question, I would say, in terms of sovereignty. What do? You don't want to rely on a rogue state. I won't name any country. The problem is that there are more and more rogue states nowadays. And, it's getting very tough. So you want to be able to produce your energy at home to a large extent. That was not a concern before, but, given the situation, it's becoming a concern. And the risk, of course, is that we do it wrong, and it will be good actually to still use market mechanism in this domain. So if we want to say, okay, let's limit our imports of various things, we could have, tradable, sellable quotas for imports. We could have a tax and whatever, but something which is market-oriented and doesn't decide, this firm is going to do it, and it's going to be this particular energy and so on. To have something which is more open to competition. And, we won't get it right, but at least we will limit the damage.
Just a few words, since we're running over time. First, in order to achieve those objectives efficiently, remember tenders, auctions tend to work. But it's also useful to distinguish between different kinds of problems. If you have green problems, which are local problems, like diesel pollution, right? It's not a global problem. It's the usual approach of state aid probably kind of works pretty well. Germany wants to deal with this. He wants to encourage the production of more efficient diesel and so on. One can make the argument that's fine. But when you start talking about global, like CO, then you have a risk that some state with resources might say, oh, we're doing it because it decreases CO. And we're going to do all of the CO decrease that the EU committed to here in our country as a disguise for favoring your company. So it's essentially a question of the allocation of the targets. So when you've got a more global problem, it's very important to have first targets that are set at the European level and have a way of making sure that it's not the kind of problem that I mentioned. That's already a problem with CO, but that gets even kind of harder when you talk about self-sufficiencies. I'm completely favors the integration of self-sufficiency consideration in state aid and competition policy. But again, does one country get to subsidize their company to satisfy all of the self-sufficiency needs of Europe? And by the way, another point of self-sufficiency is that actually the way we've dealt with them, with this, this first of a kind and so on, we actually have a framework right now that doesn't start where they should start, which is defining what are the self-sufficiency needs. If you have a self-sufficiency need in the kind of chips, what kind of capacity do we need to meet it? If we don't have this to start with, how can we make sensible policy?
May I? No, I think that we are about to end, and I think that this is quite true what you have said. I think that yes, when thinking about state aid, we also need to take into consideration that ensuring that we do not distort or make the single market is absolutely crucial. So these temptations, depending on the fiscal space that each country may have, need to be prevented and avoided. First comment. Second comment, of course, it could be fantastic to have a kind of general state aid approach based on the European dimension and based on tenders process so that the different companies could compete, and we have the European budget to cope with the European interests. The most similar thing that we have managed to develop is the IPCIs, and to what extent this can combine public funding coming from the member states and public funding coming from the Commission with the private funding coming from the interested companies in a process that it is more or less competitive. There are elements of competition between the different people that apply for these initiatives. And I think that it is a good thing, but of course it relies very much on the capacity, the fiscal capacity of the member states supporting the concrete initiatives that may be identified. But it is an important aspect where we still have room for improvement, even if it is not going to solve everything either. So I think that that's for sure. And then I don't know if I may have a joke. Instead of asking you the whys.
Please.
No, because I was a bit desperate because I saw that you had so many relevant points when trying to identify how perfect the context should be, so to take the perfect decisions.
No, we never.
I think that we have fantastic professionals, but I don't know if we are perfect in as a joint. So I think that, in fact, what it has been the whole story and background of this independent authority that the DG Competition is that they have been quite professional in how they seek the evidence, follow the procedures, try to have an open mind on how they can combine the existing references to make sound decisions, and how they try to keep an eye to be sure that they follow, understand, and anticipate the evolution of the markets and the market forces. And I think that this is the case. And I think that we can all agree not only that there are sustainability goals that are common policy goals supported by all European citizens in general, but there's also a common aspiration to update our industrial capacity. Not to resign ourselves to decide, okay, someone will come with the very low-cost products to serve our needs, because we will be impoverishing our own economy. So I think that, being fair, we need to find out how we can accommodate within our framework, with our limitations, with the most possible sound references, the way we use the tools we have, and to assess to what extent the tools we have are enough, because we have not talked about the foreign subsidies regulation, because we have not talked about the Digital Markets Act. There are other challenges that may deserve another meeting with this very fantastic panel, because I have to leave.
You'll be busy.
But I think,
You'll be busy.
but I think that well, the reality is changing, not always in the good direction, as you were commenting in your introductory remarks. But I honestly think that that we live in the best place to live, and with the best professionals to take care of the competition tools in Europe.
So I've been given the role to ring the bell, which is not a nice thing to do, I realize, and to invite everyone to continue the discussion over our cocktail and dinner. But before letting you go, maybe one final question. This is the start of a new mandate for you, but for all of us in the antitrust community. This is an exciting time when a new mandate starts. We can feel that there are new challenges, new dynamics. So to generate the discussion during the cocktail, I'd like to ask each of you what is your wish and what is the wish of your panelists for your mandate.
I said it since the very beginning. I came to take notes.
So if you want to go first, I think that if 5 years from now we can sit here and say, Of course, we haven't solved all the problem, but we've made some progress in incorporating some less traditional dimension of policy within our traditional approach to competition policy without damage. That would be great.
Well, I'm not sure. We need, obviously, we need more Europe again, and we need to have principles set actually by the Commission so as to guide. I mean, if we want to have those, I said, they are dangerous to incorporating those very legitimate objectives. If we are going to do it, and sometimes there is a good case for doing it, we have to do it with a lot of guidance, I will say. That's very important. We cannot just let people without measurement, without principles, without anything, decide on decisions which are really political in the first place.
So I've taken note and subscribe the goals being underscored by Pierre, and I take note and subscribe the advice on how to proceed being expressed by Jan. And I take note that we will be receiving your recommendations and pieces of advice in this term, because you are right, you are also part of the community, and I think that we have huge challenges, and we will need to work and to learn and to take into consideration your good evidences and recommendations to improve the quality of what we do and to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.